President.
Senator from Delaware is recognized.
Mr. President, I rise today to address the chaos that has been caused by this week's disastrous, unprecedented, and unconstitutional funding freeze directive. Then-candidate Trump said on the first night of the Republican National Convention that starting on day one, we will drive down prices and make America affordable again. I don't think the actions of this week have contributed to making America affordable again or driving down prices at all. Instead, when the White House abruptly announced a complete halt to all domestic grants that cover trillions of dollars of spending to thousands of organizations, from medical research to police and fire, from construction projects to daycares and senior centers, it caused great chaos and concern. I got calls, texts, emails from hundreds of Delawareans, from the state and local governments, from nonprofits, from business leaders saying, what does this mean? Meals on Wheels and school lunches for Delawareans in school, opioid prevention programs and community health care centers, critical programs for military families stationed at Dover Air Force Base, and police and fire departments up and down the state raised their hand digitally to say, what does this mean and where are we going? The Delaware delegation convened a conference call that day with 250 different participants to try and give them clarity on the path forward. I hope that this disastrous directive has been rescinded, but I only can say I hope because I don't truly know. The White House press office tried to rescind the rescission, so it is unclear exactly what its status is now. There have been filings in court, both in the district court for D.C. and for Rhode Island. There's an injunction against the OMB order here in D.C. There is an injunction or a TRO under consideration up in Rhode Island, but it created a mess. It created a mess at a time when Americans need clarity. What I've heard from business and business leaders for decades is that predictability is the most important part for businesses to grow. And what I've heard from families and friends at home was that this was not the sort of start they had expected to the Trump administration. I want to caution folks. We may not know when or if the administration will try this order a second time or a third time. I'll remind you that at the beginning of the last Trump administration, he tried to pass a Muslim travel ban, a ban on people coming to this country from a series of Muslim-majority countries. That ban was enjoined in federal court. It was blocked. They tried again. It was blocked. They tried a third time. It was ultimately found to clear judicial muster. So frankly, an administration that has said over and over again they believe that impoundment is within the scope of power of the president is likely to try again and again. Impoundment sounds like a fancy way of putting your dog on a leash in the backyard. What it means is violating our constitutional order. Article 1 of the Constitution sets the powers of Congress, and the power of the purse, the ability to say what will and won't be spent, is central to the relevance and the authority of the United States Congress. And I'll say there's a reason this is dangerous. This is bad. I am an appropriator. Those of us who serve on the Appropriations Committee every year participate in a difficult and complex process where we pull together all the different requirements and requests and issues and concerns from across our states and departments, and we pass a bill here on the floor. We pass it through the House. We send it to the President signs it, and then the directives go out for what grants and what funding will be available. I understand. President Trump won the election. There's a new majority in Congress. I fully expected that this year's appropriation process would reflect those different priorities. That's the normal order of things. But this order is reaching back to last year's appropriations and the previous president and trying to freeze it and reallocate it. That has real consequences for our ability to come to bipartisan agreements and pass legislation on appropriations if in the going forward years, presidents can say, I'm not actually going to do disaster relief for this state because I don't like them, or I'm going to freeze and cut funding for this program because it doesn't fit with my priorities, when he's already got signed legal orders. There are still impacts on the ground. I am still hearing from Delawareans that funding for construction of roads or bridges under the bipartisan infrastructure law, new energy sources, and tax credits under the Inflation Reduction Act are frozen or facing freezes. And I want to turn to another concern of mine that is critical, important, and ongoing. But let's just focus on this first point. Until Trump backs down on these illegal orders and respects Congress's power of the purse and puts his focus back on helping Americans and reducing costs, this place and our country will not function and will not get better. Nothing about this order makes us safer, more prosperous, or more secure. Mr. President, I'm speaking today in strong opposition to President Trump's illegal executive order of last Friday night that pauses all of our foreign assistance and development assistance. Let's be clear. Our development assistance, our foreign aid, isn't about charity. It's about security, and it's about values. We have alliances and partnerships around the world that are undergirded by our soft power, by our partnerships and investment in helping make the world safer, more stable, and more secure. And what happened last Friday night at the end of the workday, when there was no one there to answer urgent questions, was a freeze on all foreign assistance, with a very narrow exception for food aid. And it has caused chaos in the global community that delivers aid and assistance around the world. For days, there were questions unanswered. What did this mean in Ukraine, in Lebanon, where there's wars and ceasefires, where critical grant funding and work by contractors helps put the lights back on after Russian attacks on the electrical infrastructure in Ukraine, where ceasefire implementation in Lebanon was ongoing, in parts in the world where we were continuing to bring home to the United States those who'd served alongside us in Afghanistan, Afghan SIVs and their families waiting for processing, abandoned in Qatar and here in the United States. A halt on drug supplies that helped keep 20 million people living with HIV through the program PEPFAR, long supported by presidents and Congresses of both parties. A freeze on activity to counter fentanyl and narcotics trafficking, to push back on Chinese and Russian disinformation, and to promote democracy with urgent upcoming elections. The International Republican Institute and the National Democratic Institute are frozen in their activities and forced to lay off or furlough their workforce. Let me thank Secretary Rubio for responding to urgent calls to broaden the aperture for humanitarian waivers for this freeze. But let me also say that with dozens and dozens of the most senior people at USAID put on furlough, so implementing this got harder, and with thousands of contractors who work for USAID in countries around the world dismissed or laid off, the consequences will be severe. I'll just give you one example. I suspect everyone listening has heard of the disease Ebola. I suspect not everyone has heard of the disease Marburg. They are related. They're highly transmissive and deadly viruses. There is a new outbreak of Ebola in the capital of Uganda. There's an ongoing outbreak of Marburg in the neighboring country of Tanzania. This freeze pauses the pandemic surveillance work, the urgent public health work, the assistance we provide that makes sure that we are safe from a rapidly emerging and lethal global pandemic that we put in place after the last pandemic. When we halt foreign assistance, it has consequences. It's just 1% of our total budget. Most Americans think it's a big percent of our spending, but it's 1%, actually less than 1%, of the total federal budget. And there's a winner here. It's not the American taxpayer. Freezing programs like this causes chaos and often causes more to restart them after a review. The winner is China. Our biggest global competitor and adversary is delighted that we've handed them an opportunity to say to communities and countries around the world that we are not a reliable partner, that despite contracts and promises, commitments and programs, They now have months to crow about how we have abandoned our partnerships with country after country around the world. China's delighted when we lay off or furlough or cut the resources that help fuel the work of our diplomats and our development professionals. And China has seen its opportunity to expand its influence through programs like the Belt and Road Initiative. They've spent $1 trillion in projects across the global south in the last decade, and our ability to counter Chinese influence, to make strategic investments, has been put gravely at risk by putting on hold the workforce and the contracts that help deliver. The administration may be claiming that this pause is temporary, but its effects will not be. The lasting impacts on small businesses, on contractors, on NGOs, in loss of expertise, loss of their workforce, and loss of their credibility, I think will be lasting, dangerous, and harmful. Mr. President, I rise today to warn my colleagues about the risks posed by the nomination of Tulsi Gabbard to be Director of National Intelligence. As ranking member of the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee, I have a substantial role with our nation's intelligence community. And what we've seen already from former Congresswoman Gabbard in her hearing is alarming. Refusing to speak clearly to the actions of Edward Snowden that have earned him the title traitor. Bemoaning the rise of HTS in Syria without mentioning the fall of the brutal dictator Assad. Repeatedly dodging relevant, timely, and pointed questions about FISA and Section 702, critical to America's security. All of this, sadly, is in keeping with a long-standing record as an apologist for authoritarians and enemies of our nation. She's repeatedly blamed the United States and NATO for Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. She visited Syria and met with Assad, a brutal dictator, in 2017 and relied on pro-Assad sources to cast doubt on his horrific use of chemical weapons to attack his own people. And former Congresswoman Gabbard's long history of repeating pro-Kremlin talking points, such as the false claim the United States was operating biological research labs in Ukraine, has made her a favorite guest on Russian state media. We should be working together to elevate people in our national security apparatus who are sanctioned and banned from Russia because they've worked hard to oppose our enemies, not praised by them. Our nation faces real and growing security threats daily. We need an intelligence service resourced, equipped, and led to capably oppose them. Can we count on Tulsi Gabbard to provide that leadership? I don't think so, and I cannot support her nomination. With that, Mr. President, thank you, and I yield the floor.